Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of the Science or Fiction podcast, where we interview researchers to separate the science from the fiction in news headlines. I'm Dr. Catherine Bates. I'm a youth development and mental health researcher at King's College London.
And I'm Dr. Hannah Savage. I'm also a researcher. I study anxiety in the brain and body at the Institute of Cognitive Neuroscience at UCL. And this is the Science or Fiction podcast.
So the gender pay gap is identified as the difference in pay between men and women. A new report from the Higher Education Policy Institute has revealed that women are paid on average 11.9% less than men in higher education institutions. And these are colleges and universities across the UK where students undertake their undergraduate or postgraduate degrees. Now, women outnumber men at university. 57% of undergraduate students are women, and they make up just under 50% of the higher education workforce. So why does this pay gap exist, and what are we doing to eliminate it? A new report from the Higher Education Policy Institute reveals insights into the statistics and what changes we need to make. And this week we're interviewing the author of the report, as well as a panel of experts in science and policy to find out more about this complex issue. So I'm really pleased to welcome our panel. First, I'll introduce Professor Sophie Scott.
Hi, my name's Sophie Scott and I'm the Director of the Institute for Cognitive Neuroscience at University College London.
And we also have Dr. Salim Hashmi.
Hi, I'm Salim. I'm a lecturer in psychology at King's College London and I'm a culture, equality, diversity and inclusion lead for our Department of Psychology.
And the author of the report, Rose Stevenson.
Hi folks, I'm Rose. I'm the Director of Policy and Advocacy at the Higher Education Policy Institute.
Brilliant. Really excited to have you all here today and to get your thoughts on this topic. So, Rose, can we just start by summarising the main findings of the report and how you carried out this research?
Sure. So there's two main parts of the report. So the first one was about collecting the data. So if you're a big organisation in England, since 2007, every year you've had to work out what your gender pay gap is and you've had to report it. And it had been 5 years since mandatory reporting began, so I thought it might be interesting to dig into that and have a look. To begin with, I looked at the sector as a whole and found that the median gender pay gap across the whole sector is 11.9%. Now, there's some good news there because that's smaller for higher education than it is for the rest of the UK, and we're closing that gender pay gap faster. So there's some really good work going on. And I then looked at a few different metrics. So I looked across, it was about 120 universities, and there was a huge variety. So we had universities and colleges that had a gender pay gap, a median gender pay gap of 0%. So universities like Regent's in London, Staffordshire and Solent had a 0% median gender pay gap, all the way to the University of Buckingham, who had a 41% median gender pay gap. So you know, about as wide as you can get. So we looked at the mean as well, and similar kind of variation. And then we also looked at progress. So from where they started, how much of their gender pay gap had they eliminated? So if they had a 20% gender pay gap in 2017, and now they had a 10% pay gap, then they'd eliminated 50% of that pay gap over time. And then we also worked out how many years it would take each institution to get to not having a pay gap. And again, that was everything from nothing, they're already there, to Oxford, which was 680 years till they closed their gender pay gap, to some universities that had gone backwards and their gender pay gap was getting bigger. So given the context of this podcast, I wanted to point out how headlines can be used to give different stories. So we looked at the mean gender pay gap, and as a really interesting example is London Business School. So they've done amazing work. They've knocked 15 percentage points off their mean gender pay gap in 5 years, which puts them right at the top of that ranking, or kind of second in that ranking. So you could have a headline saying London Business School leads the way in eliminating the gender pay gap. But actually they started at 45% and they're still at 30%. So they're right at the bottom of the rankings for mean gender pay gaps now. So you could also say London Business School has a terrible mean gender pay gap. So both of those things are true. So it's, and I talk about it a lot in the report, that you've got to look at all the metrics and you've got to look at it over 5 years in order to really get a good idea. But that doesn't make interesting headlines. And there's a few examples of that. So part 2 of the report, we then looked into, well, why is there still a gender pay gap? How is it that we've got this variation? What's happening in those institutions that have a small gender pay gap, and what's happening in the ones with a big gender pay gap? And can some of those institutions learn from each other?
So firstly, to quickly define the mean and the median here. So the mean is calculated by adding all the rates together and divided by the total number of employees. And the median is the middle number in a series of numbers. So that's why you report both, right? Because the median is less likely to be like skewed by big salaries.
Thanks, Rose. So you mentioned the difference between the median and the mean gender pay gap, but I was also interested in the range of salaries, meaning the lowest and the highest wage. So did you find that this also varied between universities, or again by gender? And was it that some universities were paying perhaps a select few men a really high salary?
Yeah, for sure. So we definitely saw a difference between the mean and the median and the types of universities that had a high mean, for example. So universities that we call research intensive, they do a lot of research, they tended to be more clustered into having a high mean gender pay gap, which suggests that they're paying kind of some outliers at high levels, which they might be. You know, if they've got the world leading expert on COVID vaccines, you know, not necessarily a bloke, but it's just an example, that they might be getting paid more. So it can, that's why it's looking at both is useful. We use the median more because it's used in some national surveys and it's good for comparison. But you do see a difference with those outliers in the mean. Asked about pay scales and salaries and what does that look like? So you have to say what percentage of women are in the lowest pay quartile, the lowest quarter of wages at your university, the lower middle, the upper middle, and the top. And I think lots of institutions have been really focused on that top quartile and getting representation and 50% of women in the top, which is brilliant. That's great. And everyone's forgotten about the bottom, or they don't want to tackle it. And I'll tell you why that's tricky in a minute. But for universities that have got a small gender pay gap, for those top 3 quartiles, lower middle, upper middle, and top, they're looking at 52-53% in all of those of women, which is probably just about where it should be. So they've got those nailed. Those who've got a big gender pay gap, there's a much bigger disparity. And they've got fewer women in the top, still quite a lot, about 40%, but fewer, and many, many more in that bottom. But even those with the small gender pay gap, that bottom bit is skewed. And lots of institutions I talked to said, yeah, we've got more women in that lower quartile because the work is flexible and it fits around care and responsibilities. That's great. Why is that flexible working not on offer in the top 3 quartiles? You know, if women are trapped in that bottom quarter because that's the only place that offers the flexible working that they need, then we're never going to see that. It's also really awkward to talk about the other side of the coin, to talk about encouraging men into those roles in the lower quartile. We don't want to talk about encouraging men into lower paid, insecure work that has less value. But if that makes us uncomfortable, we've got to stop encouraging women into those roles as well, or we need to sort out the pay and conditions in those roles.
So there's a few things that we need to unpick. Sounds like it kind of points towards like a shift in culture and like a culture change in the way that we're approaching these kind of roles. So I wonder if we can get Sophie and Salim, your thoughts on that.
But I mean, it is very difficult. And as you say, the attention has all gone at the higher end. And certainly in my institution, one of the things that we see, women are, across the university pretty well represented, particularly around sort of middle grades as well, actually. And it's when you get into the higher end that you start to find these, there are more disparities, and there still are fewer female chairs. There just are. It's much better than it was when I was here, started here 20 years ago. It's unimaginably different, but it's still different. I think it can't be the case that everybody who's taking the lower grade jobs is doing so because of flexibility. it's going to be true for a lot of people, but it's not going to be true for everyone. Certainly in my field, where we have an overwhelming dominance of female students as undergraduates in psychology, I mean, it's extraordinary. What that tends to mean in practice is that lower grade, research jobs are very likely to be going to women, because that's the cohort you're recruiting from. So in addition, there are these, kind of subject specific things as well. And yet somehow the men seem to do all right in the end, even in psychology, you still see the crossover. So one of the things that we've been identifying at UCL is how we improve the way that we can support careers going through that. If we're losing people, which is when we do lose people around the sort of middle grades, how are they not getting further on? There are fewer higher positions to go into, but still, what could we be doing to encourage people to look into that route? How can we be looking at how we approach promotions? So that's my kind of initial thought, although, I mean, it's very kind of you to describe me as an expert, but I'm more kind of somebody trying to manage the situation, I think.
I suppose I can share a few thoughts. I suppose before I do that, I do really want to just sort of acknowledge that in a conversation about the gender pay gap, I, as a cisgendered man, occupy a space of privilege in this conversation. So I just feel it important to acknowledge that. One of the things that I'm really interested in my teaching is sort of inclusive curriculum, and that when we're teaching students, we're teaching them about the context of the research and higher education. And so what I really appreciated about the report was that it opened with that context setting about how sort of when universities started to award degrees, because I think it is important to have this sort of idea of this this upfront knowledge that, although higher education is a quite liberal space, it's not perfect. And so actually there are institutional, historical, structural issues at universities that are misogynistic. And so some of the things that I have been sort of teaching in some of my teaching is sort of the experiences of the researchers behind the research. And what's really powerful, I think, is to look at the experiences of female academics, particularly in the sort of period from the 1950s to the millennium, and actually the policies in place that were discriminatory against women. And that's not that long ago. That is still quite recent, and that is the structure we're operating in. And that's also then the sort of wider structure and institution that we have to be accounting for. So I think that we need to be aware of that when thinking about the situation that we're in now.
Like, there's so many different elements to consider. It's not as simple as because I think when I first read about the gender pay gap, I was thinking like a woman in my position is being paid less than a man in the exact same position, but actually it's way more complicated than that.
Yeah, that sort of broader culture of universities, and we've inherited that from what's come before, and that was problematic in many ways.
I completely agree with you. And one of the things that's really become very clear to me is that one of the ways we do that is by, and you touched on this, but how totally we don't take part-time work seriously. And so I'm the director for EDI in Psychology and Language Sciences at UCL, and I run Hangouts, just EDI Hangouts, which are started under lockdown, so we come and talk about particular issues. And by far, and it's always been very interesting, we had one on part-time workers, and I had no idea. I knew it was bad. I had no idea how bad. Like, people are just told that they're not taking it seriously. They're never considered for promotion. They are often doing a full-time job in the hours that they're doing, and they are sort of invisible to the management structure. And it's become a bit like, for me, that was a real wake-up call to change how I do things. And I try to, but you say it's a huge culture, and a sort of, at a research university, I think often the attitude was, well, you're not a serious academic. If you aren't prepared to work full time, then, fine, you do that, but you're not really here for the difficult stuff,
Yeah, so something that was sort of related to that really struck me as I was reading the report was also whether colleagues who are employed with casual or temporary contracts for sort of teaching for a specified period of time, like 8-week contracts. So, for example, I've had casual positions as a teaching fellow where I'm paid 8 weeks at a time on casual contracts, which are very, very flexible. They're wonderful, but they don't have progression routes. So I also wonder how many colleagues are taking up whether that's accounted for in the sort of statistics that are reported, but also the demographic of people who have those contracts.
It's an enormous problem, and I think one of the things that I think is a systematic problem in universities is that we tend to do very short-term planning. We think in the academic year, student numbers for this year. We very rarely look at data varying, and so much stuff now is driven by student numbers because of the change in how universities are funded. That's really what people care about. But they're always reacting to what's happening with this year's student numbers, and they'll bring more people in temporarily to deal with this year's student numbers. And there's very little zooming out and saying, what are we doing here? And that has problems in lots of different directions. But I think, as you say, it has a specific problem for people that you are taking on in jobs that may have limited, if any, potential for actually turning into something with a career progression to it. And that's not necessarily anyone's person's responsibility for having oversight over what that would mean. And we don't think of those people as early career researchers, and they're kind of by a sort of, I'll say benevolent neglect, but maybe just neglect of any attention being paid to what that would mean, because they're just being seen in this short-term way, because everything's being seen in a short-term way. And we know that good employment practices benefit everybody, and bad employment practices systematically disadvantage women, minoritized groups. It really is, if you think about it from a workplace, kind of doing good employment practice, it's going to be having disproportionate effects on certain groups, and it looks like it is.
There are so many barriers to progress in this career, like especially as a researcher. Like you both talked about the short-term contracts. Rose mentioned in the report that I think it was over 30% of academics are on fixed-term contracts, so not permanent contracts. And that's just like, it just creates so many barriers, because you can only consider a career in research or in a university if you're able to navigate that. And there's lots of reasons why someone wouldn't be able to, considering like short-term contracts, part-time, like there's so many different elements to that.
I would say in UCL's defence, that is something that they have started to get eyes on and are starting to take a lot more seriously. But I certainly personally, I don't know if I would recommend somebody took one of those jobs.
And I wanted to pick up on part-time work as well, because it's so important, I think, when we talk about the gender pay gap. There's a website called jobs.ac.uk where you can go and look at kind of all the jobs in the UK, really, in universities, pretty much. So I just did a pretty crude survey of going in there every week and looking at the number of jobs that were available by salary band and seeing if they were advertised as full-time or part-time. And only 12% of all advertised jobs were advertised at part-time, and about 40% of the workforce works part-time. So you're really limited as to what you can do. And as you go up those salary bands, the percentage drops and drops and drops. So if you're looking at a role that's 80 to 90K, only 4% of those jobs are available part-time. So, again, those part-time jobs that fit around other life commitments are really stacked in the bottom. Wages, 20 to 30K. So you've got an issue with progression, but you've also got an issue with choice. And I think wages are massively important. Let's not beat around the bush. In 2024, people are really struggling for money, and how much you get paid is critical to how you can live your life. But there's also, to me, a question of job satisfaction and interest. And I've certainly found, and I've been very lucky in what I have done, but I've certainly found it's been really challenging to find interesting, stimulating, well-paid part-time jobs. So, Catherine, you said that you thought you might get paid less in the job that you do than a man doing the same job as you. And that's not the case. It's illegal under the Equal Pay Act to pay men and women differently for doing the same job. So the gender pay gap is looking across all jobs and then looking at who's getting paid. So it's very much to do the type of work that people go into, the type of roles, the subject areas, etc., that build into this pay gap, and then all the structural things we're talking about, like having access to flexible working, etc.
I suppose one other thing that I kind of just wanted to bring into the conversation, and again, it was in the report, but it's also the other sort of pay gap that's often reported, is the ethnicity pay gap. And what I really also liked in the report was the way it broke that down, but also considered things like disability or long-term health conditions, LGBTQ plus status, because I think that's really important to think about these intersections and how different aspects of people's identities might intersect to create further inequality. And I think that is part of the picture that we have to also be keeping in mind, that none of these aspects of identity are operating in isolation. They are intersecting with one another. But yeah, I thought it was I really enjoyed reading. Enjoyed is the wrong word. I really appreciated that aspect of the report and the way it was done.
I also just wanted to say that while it's definitely true that in law you can't pay men and women differently for doing the same job, in practice there are significant issues, and it's been interesting to see how people deal with this. So, for example, promotions in terms of academic promotions frequently only happen when people ask for them, which means in practice you only promote the people who've asked to be promoted, which means in practice you typically only frequently find yourself only promoting men. And that's something like I know of a London university that basically makes everybody apply for promotions every year. And what that's resulted in is a lot more female professors. And the jobs themselves were presumably not that different, but once you actually pay attention to what the women are doing, then they find that they end up getting promoted for something that hadn't even occurred to them they perhaps could go for. So I think there's that kind of sort of slant on it. Does mean that it's not always as following the letter of the law as you might hope.
Maybe related to that, Sophie, I was struck in the report, and I think I'd seen something similar in the Dutch gender report, that bonuses seem to be a place where there could be a really big difference between a man and a woman's salary in the end. I actually wasn't really aware that you could ever get a bonus in academia. So maybe we can quickly discuss, what do you get a bonus for, and how is that process usually applied at universities?
Bonuses, as far as I'm aware, and I think this probably does vary from university to university, so feel free to correct me if I'm wrong for your university or just wrong. It once somebody's been promoted up to the level of a chair, then in theory they're at the top of the promotion range. They can't get promoted further, but they can be considered for bonuses, and there are also bands within the professorial grades that you can get promoted within, and it's quite hard to do that. So it's more often the case that people get given bonuses, and that gets picked up in appraisals, so that the sort of bonuses and within grade professorial promotions the process for that is different from other promotions. It's happening within a conversation with your head of department. And I like the appraisal system. When I was first a postdoc, I worked for the Medical Research Council, who were kind of the first big users of appraisals. And I like it as a structure for being able to have really good conversations with colleagues about what they want and where they're at, and where, sort of potential training they could have, mentoring, what do they need? I don't consider it to be a situation where you're there kind of passing judgment on people, but I'm very aware that that is also a kind of machine for inequalities to creep in. So bearing on, also appraisals are something that happen across the university. Everyone's supposed to get appraised. We did a focus group works with Black and ethnic minority group, staff at UCL. One of the things that came out of that, of many different issues that they raised, but one of them was just a complete lack of knowledge about how promotions work, how mentorship schemes work, how they could get support. Now, all those things exist at the university, but nobody was telling those members of staff, and the place where it could be happening is the appraisals, and it's not happening. So similarly, going back to your point about the bonuses, it's also a point where there can be disparities in the, again, who's asking for a bonus, who should you be considering for a bonus? And I don't have control about what other people are doing in the appraisal system. And it's actually something I'm trying to get more discussion around the EDI implications of appraisals, full stop. So it's something I'm very aware of, and I've certainly noticed in my extremely limited experience, it is not unusual for people to ask for bonuses, and I would say it's not a random group of people that do. Fair enough, I'm not going to knock people for asking for a bonus, but what I have to do as somebody who's doing the appraisal, I have to be very aware of who I am considering for this, and it should be something I'm suggesting as much as waiting for people to ask me about.
I think that's why reports like this and conversations like this are so important. Like the fact that Hannah and I are early career researchers. We're both on fixed term contracts, but we've been in universities working for years, 7 or 8 years to get to this point or whatever. And we had no idea that bonuses existed in academia until we read this report. That's part of the problem.
Yeah, so I think this is really interesting. So I host a sort of monthly session or discussion session where we talk about issues of equality, diversity, and one of the ones we had was about a gender pay gap at KCL, led by my colleague Dr. Mayanna Duncan, and she brought up the bonus gap, because we do have a gender bonus gap, and I think unanimously everyone in the call was sort of like, hold on a minute, there are bonuses here. And that was ranging from sort of, PhD students in the call all the way up to professors who were unclear of how the system works. And so I think there is that issue of a lot of colleagues not knowing who that system is in place. When we did investigate it more, it was that line managers were responsible for nominating people for bonuses. So it's then who are the line managers, what are they doing, and what conversations are they having. But it's also then the staff members who are eligible for bonuses, because I think then we look to see who is it, and it was often permanent members of staff and permanent members of staff in specific academic roles. So I think it's again another complex combination of all the things we've been discussing that are at play then with the ideas of bonuses. But I think it is sort of probably quite a small group of senior colleagues who are getting bonuses, and at KCL the way it works is that it's a proportion of salary. So if you're already at a higher salary band and you're getting a bonus that is a proportion of your salary, and we know that there's a gender pay gap there, it's exacerbating the situation.
If we're more familiar with bonuses outside of academia, so in the professional services side of universities, and they're often called things like an excellent contribution award or something along those lines. And historically, staff members have been invited to nominate themselves or someone else for that award. So yes, then you get into questions of who is nominating themselves. And again, that question of visibility, who is already working closely with those decision makers that sees their work, who's good at self-promotion. And that's not a dirty word, I'm all for self-promotion. But it's not necessarily equitable. And so universities have started using things like giving those decision makers as heads of department the demographics of their department to say, look, you've got 60% women, you've got 30% people of colour. Just have a think about how your bonuses have gone over the last few years, and is it representative of the types of people in your department? Are part-time people getting a look in, etc.? And I think that has driven change in some institutions.
Yeah, I think that's a really nice way to come on to what we're going to do about it.
So the report states that at the rate we're moving, it'll take 14 years to eliminate this gender pay gap. And I think we can all agree that that is way, way, way too long. So what are we actually doing to change it, both at the institutional level, but also on a personal note? Is there something we can be doing in our daily lives?
So I was actually surprised at 14. It was 14 years. I thought that it was much shorter time frame for it to be closed than I thought it would be. But yeah, I agree. Let's make it even less than that. And I hope that this report does help. I am on a slight mission. My daughter is 8, that when she starts it in the workforce, that this will be something Mummy talked about that happened in her lifetime, and it won't be such a big part of her career. Maybe that's naive, I don't know, but let's go for it. So there are some recommendations in the report. Number one, flexible working as a default. It's 2024. We've done COVID. We can do it. But also part-time working. Not everybody wants to work full-time hours flexibly. If you're doing like hefty childcare, caring for an elderly relative, then sitting down at 9 o'clock and finishing your hours of work isn't always feasible. So flexible and part-time working. Something that was really interesting that came out of the report was that institutions with a small gender pay gap had a much smaller gap between the paid maternity leave that they offered and the paid paternity leave that they offered. And that does chime with some much bigger pieces of research across the OECD in terms of the impact that increasing paid paternity leave can have on the gender pay gap. And really importantly on dads as well. And I think often dads face an inequity in their choices that they can make about being involved with childcare, about being involved with their family. So offering that, so 2 universities, UAL and Regents, offer 6 months full-time paid paternity leave, which is amazing. But also encouraging the uptake of shared parental leave, of part-time flexible working for dads, and all of those things. And something else that we looked at on the research side was some of the recruitment metrics. So when researchers are recruited, often these metrics are used. They're called the H index and the M index, and they look at how many papers researchers have put out and how many times those papers were cited by other people. And there's kind of a whole host of issues in there. It doesn't take into account part-time work. It doesn't take into account breaks, career breaks from maternity leave. There's lots of research that shows citation bias is a thing. So it's kind of building in those structural inequalities that then get embedded in the recruitment process, a promotion process, etc. And everyone I talked to acknowledged that this was a thing. And yet they said, I've still got my H index on my professional profile and I still use it in recruitment. So really kind of opening our eyes to some of those structural barriers that are in place, because I really do believe, and I think that this report shows it, that it is structural, and therefore if we can sort out some of those structures, it's going to make a really big difference.
One thing, thank you very much for that, Rose. I'd be very, very careful about the flexible working. Universities would be delighted to have people doing more flexible working because they do not have to pay for buildings. You can end up sharing flexible shared space. They can get rid of all those expensive offices. We will miss this hugely if we go down this route. It's already happening. We should be doing everything to acknowledge. In fact, universities are places like theatres where we thrive on the fact that we are in a shared environment with other people. So I'm passionate about this. It is not a good direction. I think absolutely what we should be doing is giving respect and possibilities to the doing jobs part-time. And in fact, the zoom out from that, your point that you made, the real big point where we lose people, and we know this, so we see this great, dropping off of the female workforce in academia, lo and behold, in their 30s when they have children. And it's absolutely central that we do more to support fathers, but we've got to do so much more to support mothers. It's ridiculous. University College London has a nursery, which is fabulous, and it can take something like 25 children. It won't even cover like my faculty for the number of people, so we do that sort of thing. We're beginning to tackle with the seriousness of all the things we could be doing to support people, to enable them to work part-time and to weather the phenomenal hit that careers take, male and female, but mostly female, when you have children. We do almost nothing. We've done things like at UCL, when you come back from parental leave, you get a year of sabbatical automatically. That, so you're still not back doing teaching and things like that. That's a baby step. Another feature of what we could be doing here is much more careful helping people with their career progression from early years through to later years. So there are actually things that are really good about an academic career and being a parent, and no one ever talks about, but no one cares if a paper was written at the weekend. one of my favourite papers, one of my most impactful papers, was written when I and my co-author were both heavily pregnant. We did the revisions when my son had been born, and she was so pregnant she couldn't sit at a desk. And then we did the final set of revisions when both babies had been born, and we walked around Queen Square, so we got them both asleep, and then tore back to my office to finish the paper. And there's nothing in that, there's just a great paper. It's a lovely paper. There's none of that around it, but it's doable. I knew people who had babies when I had my child who were working for The Guardian in the print side of things, who were coming back from work and having to work evenings, having to work nights, and having to spend all their money on nannies who would sleep the night over, which cost more than their whole salary, because the employer was absolutely intransigent about them not being able to sort of change their working hours because they were now back at work with a small baby. So there are, there are things that we are already doing, and we're not talking about, we're not supporting people with this, we're not having these conversations. There are enormous systematic things we can be doing as a university to actually make that easier for people. And exactly, to go back to your point, parental leave more generally and supporting fathers is a central element of that.
I think talking about it is so important, isn't it? And I want, coming back as well to the progression that Sophie, you talked about earlier, in terms of bringing bonuses and things like that up in appraisals, and line managers making sure that they're aware of that. And I guess it's us all making sure that we're aware of all of these issues and taking a small action each. And for example, what's most relevant to me right now is that progression in research and in my job. And I try and talk about my salary and my role to anyone that will listen. When I'm talking to other early career researchers or postdocs, I'm like, well, I'm on this. And last year, I've been a postdoc for 2.5 years. And last year I applied for a promotion, with the grant that we got, and I got a promotion, but I didn't know that was happening, or that was possible without having a very good line manager that was willing to support me through that. So it's small things like this, to be aware that, for example, females will get to a certain age and be faced with all of these issues, and we need to make sure that we're creating an environment where they can move forward in this career.
Yeah, I think that's a really nice sort of, because that kind of what I wanted to say is that this needs to be something that we're all taking seriously. So for me, it is really about allyship. And for me, as a man, allyship is a really active thing, and it should be a really active thing for everyone. And what we do tend to see, I can't speak for other universities, but particularly at King's, is that spaces related to equality and diversity are predominantly made up of women, and then predominantly made up of people with other minoritized identities. I mentioned that I hosted that session on the gender pay gap, and to sort of remind myself of all the issues, I kind of went back to the recording and did a quick count. There were about 23 people in the meeting. 16 of those were all women. And then of the sort of 6 or 7 men there, it was only 2 of them who were from sort of senior teams. And I think we do need to have really frank and open discussions about why those things are the case. I think Catherine, you've raised this thing about an interesting point about talking about it, because we don't often talk about salaries. It's in the UK and in British culture in particular, a conversation we tend to skirt around, and I think that's problematic, because what you don't then see is sort of, well, okay, I know I was employed on the same grade as a colleague doing the same work I'm doing, but within that grade, what is the difference? But I think then also not just talking about salary, but talking about recruitment processes and negotiations of salaries. I think that there are so many people who don't think about negotiating salaries at the point of recruitment and interview. And I think that was something that someone that was raised in that discussion, was that actually we need to be talking to all of our students about what they're doing when they're interviewing, and not to sort of just accept a salary, but think about whether there is room for negotiation there. But then, yeah, I think it is also about promotion. I really do think we need to be having conversations about promotion, but also, in my opinion, it sounds a bit radical, rethinking promotion in higher education, because what you're essentially doing is saying, you're already working at this role. We need you to recognize that you're working in this role, and have then the confidence to apply for promotion, which then is quite rigid the way it works at our institution is that there is one deadline every year. And if you don't get through it, you cannot apply then for a set number of years. So that puts people off applying until they're feeling really confident. And that's subjective. When do people feel confident? When do they feel ready? But then it also then again has problems for colleagues who are on maternity leave at the point at which that deadline is. So I think we need to rethink promotion to make it much more objective, but much more fair. And I really like the idea, Sophie, that you sort of had said about like everyone has, I think it was you, Sophie, mentioned that everyone has to apply every year, because then you're removing that subjective thing. And if it is just objective, that is the way it should be. And then my final point, I'm sorry if I'm taking up a lot of like space. I feel really, really more and more sort of radical about things like this. I do think we just need to be really, really open and transparent about the ways in which these things are working. So as well as things like the H index, but talking to students about how there are biases in student feedback that are more that mean that male lecturers often get better evaluations than female lecturers, and how that feeds into promotion applications, but also how ready people feel for promotion applications. But also, again, this is because I don't really understand finance sometimes, because it's all made up money. But I think if there is a gender pay gap, and we know part of it is because of these kinds of issues of recognition, like we can do something about that from the top down. Like that doesn't have to always be on the individual. If it's a structural issue, there should also be structural changes. And I think we also need to be part of the reason why, the UCU strikes over the gender pay gap, because actually it's an employer issue.
If I could just pick up on salary negotiations there, I always encourage my female colleagues in particular, negotiate when you're going for a job. But actually, I want to see that end. I want salary negotiations to end. I think salary should be in the job description. None of this competitive pay, competitive package nonsense where it's a secret about what the salary is. There is a wage for doing that job. That's the wage. It's not negotiated, because then you get rid of that problem of who's negotiating and who's not. And I do know that universities and other institutions and organisations are moving in that direction. That this is the salary, that's what you're getting, and it's much more upfront. But on both the kind of individual and the institutional, what are we going to do about it? You can also go onto the HEPI website, who I work for, and we've put the tables on there with all the institutions we looked at. So you can look across those 5 metrics I talked about, and see where your institution is in reference to other universities and higher education colleges, and talk about it with your colleagues, talk about it with your line managers. Make sure that it is on the agenda, particularly if your institution isn't doing so well.
On the point of negotiation, I feel like, especially as an early career researcher, we kind of have less space to negotiate. Often your position is kind of costed into a grant. It's a fixed amount. So yeah, I guess as we've discussed, it's sort of the higher up the chain you go is when the disparity in some way disappears. But that's where negotiations come into it. I feel like that flexibility to maybe decrease the gap at a lower age or career stage is less so possible. Also, I guess that's the time, as Sophie said, that we maybe want more flexibility, but I'm not sure if we're close to achieving that at the moment.
Thank you all for such interesting insights, and I do think it's been quite a positive conversation in terms of how we're moving forward and what we can do, which is really important. And it does seem like that we can kind of split it into these the structural changes we need, which is support from employers, like the different initiatives that Sophie you mentioned in terms of parents coming back to work and making promotions more not accessible but visible, I guess. And then also on a personal level, just trying to get around a lot of those unknowns. And the more we talk about this and have this conversation, hopefully there will be less unknowns, and we can kind of support each other through that. So thank you so much for being here today. I've really learned a lot about such a complex issue, and I feel really ready to go forward and like support people to make a difference and make sure they're being like appreciated in their roles and being able to progress in their roles. So that's really exciting. Thanks again to Sophie Scott, Salim Hashmi and Rose Stevenson for coming onto the podcast today. And thank you all for listening. You can follow us for updates and more information at Instagram and TikTok at Science or Fiction Pod, and on X at Sci or Fiction Pod. If you want to get in touch or you have a suggestion for a future topic, you can email us at info@scienceorfiction.co.uk or DM us on social media. And as always, you can find the report that we've discussed and link to support at www.scienceorfiction.co.uk. Thank you to Dr. Hannah Savage for co-hosting and helping to produce this episode, to the Young Person Advisory Groups for their input on this series, and thank you to Kit Studio for the branding and Jamie Johnson for the music. See you next time.